My name is Shah Sheikh. I work as a senior security consultant at DTS Solutions based in Dubai in the UAE. And one of the key discussion points today is around building security operation centers. And the reason why is throughout the last 2 days, what we've identified is the cyber threats are going to grow and are already significantly growing and targeting different types of systems, applications across enterprise environments. And one of the key things that are usually missed out by enterprises is logging and monitoring. So the agenda that we're going to be discussing is the need to build an enterprise-wide cybersecurity operations center. The components of the CSOC, or what we call CSOC 2.0, and you'll see the reason why we call it 2.0. The key components of building a CSOC is obviously SIEM solutions, which is Security Information Event Management, a tool that actually collects all the logs, correlates them, and provides security analytics and correlation information, and also try to understand specific threat cases that are within your enterprise environment itself. The most important thing in trying to identify an attack breach is to basically build early warning detection systems within your enterprise. And this is something that we find quite often, specifically in the Middle East, because it's a hot target. You have a lot of investment within the Middle East where, for example, organizations are building smart cities. Everything is from the smart devices, from smartphones. You can actually, if you wanted to book a train ticket, you could do it through your phones. You can pay, metering and taxis. Everything can be done through the phone. So everything is basically being put onto smart cities environments. And within the Middle East, they're building basically a huge data store of information from IoT devices, sensors, which developers can then use to create nice applications. So of course, the requirement to then perform monitoring and reporting becomes more and more important. And as part of the CSOC, of course, you need to build processes, procedures in order to identify exactly how to carry out the incident response when an incident does occur. So what are the current challenges? Onslaught of security data, right? So within an enterprise environment, you probably have perimeter firewalls, you have a DMZ, you have web application firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, you might have an internal data center firewall. At the endpoint, you might have antivirus, malware protection, data leakage preventions. You have a huge number of different type of devices within your enterprise environments, each one of them generating huge amount of logs. And as a security analyst who's basically performing security operations cannot simply understand these logs, right? You need a tool to be able to correlate them, right? And at the same time, what we're finding is that cybersecurity is moving into a very kind of a precious area because the regulations are being enforced by the government. So what we find, for example, at least in the region that we work in, that the government is actually developing information security standards and enforcing it onto the enterprises. So just like, for example, you have ISO 27001, you have a country-specific security regulation that is pushed to the enterprises, so the government, semi-government, federal entities, they have to comply to these security standards. And that's the only way the organization is going to invest in security and implement the right type of controls. So the dynamics are changing. The other thing also that we're finding is that the line between having a breach and legal matters or legalities within cybersecurity is also changing. So if you look at, for example, in the UK, if there's a cybersecurity breach, the government has the right to fine an organization for the negligence of the breach. Right, so I'm not sure if you guys saw the hacking attempt that happened in the UK for TalkTalk, right? Which where something like around 4 million PII information was stolen. They're now under an investigation, and approximately, they're going to possibly be fined around millions of pounds. So the point here is that legal framework is also changing. Of course, when you're looking at protecting your organizations, it's very common to find that organizations are inadequately prepared. Why? Because there's no coordinated incident response. There's no understanding of the assets that you have, or the digital assets that you have, the system owner, the technical owner, who to escalate to, and who to respond to. So typically, one of the things we found, and this is a very classic example, in 2012, one of the major oil and gas companies in Saudi was impacted with a malware called Shamoon. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the malware, but it basically impacted 40,000 endpoints within the organization. So first of all, the compromise happened through compromising a privileged access for system admin for domain controller, and then basically took control of 40,000 machines. The malware was then installed, and it was a time bomb. So basically, it executed exactly at 11 o'clock on a specific day, which basically remove the master boot copy of the entire endpoints, basically making all the 40,000 machines useless. Now, of course, if you had monitoring controls in place, you could actually be proactive in understanding what is happening to your environment. Now, that particular malware was specifically designed for 32-bit systems. Now, their servers were running 64-bit architecture. So that's the only reason why the servers actually survived the attack. So we're saying, at least in the region that we work in, a huge amount of attacks coming from different organizations because of hacktivism activity, geopolitical reasons, etc. Right? So there are two approaches in building a SOC. You can either in-house it or you can outsource it. Right? So as an organization, what you can do is you can build the expertise within your environment. Right? Or you could simply outsource it to a trusted service provider. But one of the challenges is typically you can outsource security, but you cannot outsource your risk, right? So typically what we find is that successful SOC implementation is usually done within the organization itself, and that it's a separate organization or department that's developed. So it doesn't have a reporting line to IT. It actually has a reporting line much higher up in the organizational chart, and it has key teams from the finance department, from the HR department, etc. And this goes back to the point of user education, which was done about previous session, right? Social engineering is a very common way to carry out exploits within an organization. So the SOC team is not only responsible from monitoring your activities around event logs, but also responsible to educate and raise the awareness of information security within the different departments. So why do you need to build the CSOC, right? It's designed to be the nucleus, so it's the heart of any organization from a security point of view, right? It's doing continuous monitoring, continuous prevention. It's identifying any attacks, so all your different log sources are, integrated into your SIEM solutions. And of course, you can build computer emergency response teams around it as well. So if there is an incident, you know exactly the protocol to follow to be able to remediate, right? So what are the key objectives of a SOC? Manage and coordinate the response of cyber threats and incidents. Monitor the cybersecurity posture and report deficiencies, right? Perform threat and vulnerability assessment. So as mentioned in the previous presentation, we're talking about patch management. Patch management should be applied on a regular basis, right? Whenever there's, for example, a new vulnerability that's disclosed, immediately there should be a patching cycle within the day, within 2 days, depending on the criticality. Now, whose responsibility is it? Right? So it could potentially be the responsibility of a SOC, because they have the ultimate authority to say, we've identified that there's a new vulnerability on this particular system, and they then inform the system owners that please make sure that this system is then patched, right? So you can now see the link when it comes to building a security operations center. Another important reason why you need to build a SOC is, we've over the last 2 days, we've heard about cybersecurity breaches, hacking attempts, all the nice different malwares that are being created, etc. But the most important thing for an enterprise is how quickly you can recover from a breach, right? So you must define RTOs, recovery time objectives. How long can my web application or my database be down? How long can the outage last for before there's significant impact to the business, right? So the ability to automate the requirements to meet compliance. So I'm not sure about the landscape within Romania, but certainly within the Middle East, there's a huge requirement for compliance. So specifically, if you're working for a bank, you have to be PCI compliant because they want to trade in Master and Visa cards. So without this, you cannot. They will not be trading with you. Also for government entities, you have to be at least ISO compliant. But also some of the organizations are state dependent. So the states actually create security policies and enforce it with the federal entities and the public sector. At the same time, if you're working within oil and gas sector, there are specific frameworks like IEC 62443 that can help you basically improve your security posture. So by creating and building compliances, you can build the compliance framework into the security operations center. Other things that are important is to build processes, right? So, for example, there are a huge number of processes that need to be developed as part of a CSOC, and that's something that we'll discuss later on. But one of the things that you could do is, when you're building a security operations center, you don't necessarily have to invest in a huge team of individuals that are security analysts, malware reverse engineers, incident responders, etc. You could actually build, capabilities within your team, as well as your extended team within, for example, the IT department, right? So you have your system admins, your network admins, your security admins, etc. At the same time, you could build trusted relationship with service providers that can provide you advanced services. So what are the components of building a SOC, right? So real-time monitoring is important, so data aggregation. So just as you have in your enterprise environment, depending on what kind of industry you work in, you have perimeter, next generation firewall, intrusion prevention systems, web application firewall, load balancers, SSL offload, explicit proxy. The list goes on and on, right? You need to be able to integrate all of these devices into a centralized SIEM solution, right? Which is basically your log aggregation point. Of course, one of the most important things is to correlate the data. So if a user has logged in remotely on his SSL VPN from Dubai, and at the same time, within 5 minutes, he's logged in from Russia, then you can correlate the two data, the two source IP addresses. You know, a user cannot be in two different locations within the same time, right? So you can use this kind of data to identify that there's something suspicious going on. But also building a security operations center, it's important that you justify to management what you're doing, right? So you need to have key SLAs and KPIs to say, for example, within this month, we've actually defended against 50 attacks. We've prevented, 5 different attempts where USBs were wanted to be plugged in, etc., right? So this will allow you to then gain better advantage point in getting better investment from a security perspective. So key success factors in building a SOC: people, process, and technology. And I know this is a term that's used everywhere, but people, obviously, they need to be trained. You need to have the right set of people to be able to deliver CSOC. You need to have the processes, and of course, the technology to complement all of that. So just to quickly cover some of the points, proactive monitoring is important, right? So being able to make sure that you monitor all the different types of devices that are connected in your network. Alert notification is important. If there is a security breach, who to notify, what is the severity level, where is the risk level, and how do you remediate that? So the most important question to ask yourself is, if one of your critical assets or ERP solutions or web services, which is performing e-commerce transaction, if it's been breached, how do you do the incident response? Do you have a plan in place already, right? Event correlation is important. Compliance and auditing, as mentioned before. Change management. Whenever there's a configuration change in your infrastructure, you need to be able to make sure that it doesn't impact security, right? So for example, I'm a firewall admin, I log into the perimeter firewall, I make a modification because I need to allow a port on my web server, but this could impact security, right? So change management within IT infrastructure must correlate to security. Incident response, behavior analysis, reporting aspects. Again, these are very important points. And of course, everything is then comes down to from a risk perspective. So now, when we look at a sample architecture, you can see here, for example, you have all the different type of components. You have your internet layer. This is where you connect to the service providers. You might have 2 service providers. But you have your perimeter, which is typically your next generation firewall. You have potentially might be having distributed denial of service or DDoS mitigation tools, your IPS, etc. And then you have your DMZ or published services. This is the primary attack vector from the external point of view, right? And then you might have internal middleware type of applications, backend databases, mainframes, etc. These are all sitting above what we call the data acquisition layer, right? Collecting the data from different methods using syslogs, APIs, XML, ODBC, log files, etc. And on top of that, you have the data collaboration layer, where you have policy management, asset management, security vulnerabilities, along with event correlation layer as well. And of course, sitting above that, you have the security management aspect, which is reporting to the key management. Now, typically, when building a SOC, we've seen it successfully implemented where you have similar components, right? So here, you have your different devices, all sending log data to your SIEM solution, right? So an Active Directory, for example, if you integrate your Active Directory into the SIEM, you're going to get all the logs, right? So security logs, event logs, system logs. Now, what happens if an administrator for the Active Directory, going back to your presentation, he logs in and modifies the user GPOs or the machine GPOs? This impacts the entire domain. These kind of activities should be monitored, and then should be monitored against, was it a valid change request? Did somebody actually raise a change request to perform this action, right? So you can now see the link. where you have the logs, you need to be compliant. Does it meet the compliance requirements? And does it meet the requirements from a change perspective? Some of the other things that can also be done is integrating with service desk. So for example, if there is an incident, how you actually raise a ticket for the investigation to occur. And also you can integrate with vulnerability assessment tools as well. So what are the key, some of the components? You have SIEM, which is not just log management, right? So you're collecting events, but also collecting flows, right? Net flows, J flows, IPICs. But another important aspect is building assets, right? How many, if I ask, for example, the question of, do you know all the assets within your enterprise environment, and have you classified them on a risk level from a criticality of high to low risk? Are you able to do that? The usual answer is typically no, right? So it's important to build an asset database of all the digital assets within your environment. And that could be not just PCs and servers, but also smart devices, like for example, printers, voice over IP, wireless access points, etc. Right? Configuration management is important as well. So typically when we look at, for example, the Security Operations Center first generation, you would find that most of the organizations have a log management tool, which is acting like a SIEM, collecting all the data, and the security analysts are just looking at the logs without really understanding what activities are happening, right? And then you have the security auditors who are running, for example, the vulnerability management tool, like your Nessus, your Rapid7, etc., and just scanning the network, identifying the vulnerabilities, and then getting them down to the system owners to patch the systems. And then you have the networking team, who are just simply monitoring using an SNMP monitoring tool, the links, switches, routers, etc. Right? Now, each one of these is working in a silo. They don't have any integration. So, for example, if we find a distributed denial of service attack on a network interface that's connected to your internet zone, right? That will have a security impact. But the person that's going to identify it is going to be the network monitoring guys, because they're monitoring the internet perimeter router using SNMP. So the approach is usually to have an integrated SOC, right? So where you can build automation. So one of the key things that can be done is you can send all the logs from your different type of devices to your SIEM solution. And then one of the things you can find, for example, is the SIEM solution connects to the service desk whenever there's, for example, incidents that need to be reported and offenses that need to be generated. And at the same time, at the top right-hand side, you'll see vulnerability assessment, right? So the security auditors are carrying out scans, or pen testers are carrying out VAPT exercises. All that vulnerability data is now coming back into the SIEM, so you are able to identify that a particular system that has been, where you do see malicious traffic or suspicious activity, it actually does have a vulnerability, right? And at the same time, compliance and monitoring. So this is typically the integration points when we see a successful SOC being implemented. Now, some of the key important points in building a SOC is to have the processes in place, right? Data security monitoring, right? Data asset classification, normalization, data distribution, event management. Each different type of device generates a huge amount of logs. So if you take, for example, a Cisco ASA firewall, it has generally something like 17,000 logs that it can generate, events. Right? Obviously, we're not interested in that because it is not all security specific. So you have to define exactly the type of syslog event IDs that you want. The same thing that goes for Microsoft Active Directory or domain. It generates a huge amount of logs, right? So you have to define exactly which event IDs that needs to be monitored. And then having an incident response practice in place. So if there's an incident breach, what are the things that need to happen? One of the things that we've usually come across is whenever there's a breach, the customers or enterprises are not prepared in terms of the readiness of it, right? So having a process in place in terms of communicating to the right individuals, how to isolate, how to contain the issue, these are very important aspects. And in many cases, you then have to also report to national certs, right? So if you have a national cert in the country, sometimes you're also expected to integrate and talk to them as well. You should also build a SOC operating guideline, right? So how often do the SOC analysts work? Is it 8x5, 24/7, depending on the type of support you need? Escalation management is very important, right? You need to be able to ensure that whenever there is a cybersecurity breach, you escalate to the right points in time. Data recovery procedures, as mentioned, right? So whenever there's a breach, you need to be able to recover. And also, every single type of security incident has a different outcome, right? So, email phishing attack, there's a different communication mechanism in place. If there's a malware outbreak, there's a different process in place. If there's a DDoS attack, again, there's a different outcome in place. If there's an internal disgruntled employee who's not happy with the organization because he's being terminated and installing a backdoor, there's another process in place. So the point here I'm trying to make is, within a SOC, you have different types of incidents, and different incidents will have different actionable items. And just furthermore, vulnerability patch management, and one of the important things is to build operating guidelines. I mean, I'm skipping through some of the slides, but you will get them as part of this. So it's very important that when you're building a SOC, you understand your overall environment, right? Without this, you're blind. So you can only monitor what you know. So identify your infrastructure. You know, what kind of environments do you have? Your internet connectivity, DMZ, backend data centers, MPLS infrastructure, you have extranets, you have connectivity to third parties, IPsec, SSL VPN. Try to understand what your infrastructure looks like, because once you understand your infrastructure and you understand the services, then you will have better, you'll have better success factor in building a SOC. This is one of the things that we typically tend to do, at least, but you'll see at the top. Let me try to get my mouse working. All right, so this is a typical example where we basically build a security catalog. And what is this? This is the internet routers. These are the perimeter firewalls. This is the DNS server. This is the web. This is the load balancer with web application firewall, and this is the web server. So, if you're an enterprise and you're providing, for example, e-commerce services, typically this is the kind of service you might be, or security you might be following. It's important that you understand all the services you're providing on your DMZ services and start creating the flows. So here, if you follow, for example, my mouse, you come through the internet routers, through the perimeter firewall on the ingress zone and egress zone. You'll be coming into the load balancer, which will hit the virtual IP, which will then come back to the firewall as an internal zone, and then come back out again and hit the server. So this is my server here. Now, understanding the service flows will allow you to monitor this service for any abnormalities, any security breaches. And that's exactly what you need to monitor within your operations center. Using heat maps to visualize is also becoming more and more important, because in SOC, we always find that there's a huge amount of logs that come in, and it's very difficult to identify exactly the particular log that might be causing an intrusion. So building heat maps is important. And you can again integrate vulnerability data into your SIEM solution as well. Building an asset repository is very important, right? So every single digital asset within your enterprise environment should be labeled. And if you follow any compliance standards or international security standards like ISO 27001, PCI, IEC 62443 for SCADA, and also there was a lot of discussions yesterday around IoT security, where some of the guys were mentioning there's no standards. There is no standard, but there is a working progress standard for NIST, cyber and physical security draft. So there are standards that are being developed. But it's important that you build an asset repository and you identify, for example, the business owners and the technical owners, because when there is a breach, you don't only need to inform the technical person, the IT administrator, but you also need to inform the business owner, right, who owns the business process. As part of building a SOC, you need to, of course, harden your infrastructure. So this is an example where you should look at the firewall configuration and start performing hardening guidelines and identify what needs to be hardened. So once you've identified that you need to build the SOC, you need to start creating threat cases. So identify exactly, for example, within your environment, what kind of threat cases you need to develop. So you will have extranet environments, intranet environments, data center, Active Directory, net flow analysis, remote access, wireless. These are all the different environments within your enterprise, and you need to build threat cases. I'll give you an example. Everybody uses emails to communicate. 90% or even 95% of our communication is over emails, right? Now, within an enterprise, you typically tend to use Microsoft Exchange. Now, within Microsoft Exchange, if there is an Exchange administrator, he can literally log on to the machine on the Exchange server, copy the mailbox of CEO and drag and drop it into his mailbox or save it on a USB. Right? So if you're not monitoring privileged access or privileged accounts, you can't identify any non-compliances or non-conformities. So these are the types of threat cases that should be developed within your enterprise environment. So what you can do, for example, build configuration baseline documents for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, for Windows machines, for example. So this is a threat case document for a Windows environment. So if you see here, OS Win 010, this is basically the offense naming convention. So what you can do is when you're building threat cases in your environment, you can give it a specific naming tag, and that's the tag you used when you generate offenses. That's exactly the tag that you use. So multiple logon from a single user from different locations, right? This should not happen. Could obviously indicate a breach, or the password is being shared with another user in another country, right? So these are some of the things that you can actually develop within your environment. So just to give an example, in building threat cases, it's not a clear diagram, but I'll try to explain it. So you have an AIX server. So it's like an IBM AIX server, Unix type of Unix-based system. You have two users, users A and users B, right? They're both SSH connecting, remote access, SSH on the AIX server. Now, user A logs in with his unique username. User B logs in with his unique username. But both of them perform the sudo or su root, right? So both become root users. Now, how are you able to differentiate root user belongs to user A or user B? Right? So the point is that you have to correlate the data, and you have to go through the environment and understand the different services you're providing and make sure that you're monitoring the right things, because more often than not, what we find is, customers deploy SIEM solutions and build a security operations center, but actually 80–90% of the times they're not monitoring the right things. Building an offense management workflow, right? So the most important thing is within building a SOC is to reduce the false positives. So you can build a workflow. One of the things you could also do is build an internal wiki page within SOC. So all the different threat cases that I mentioned, you can actually import them into the wiki page itself. So basically, when you're building a SOC, it's a centralized internal portal for all the different threat cases. It has Google-like features. All the same processes, the documentations are added into the portal itself. So this is just the SOC Wiki page. What's fed into it? All the different processes that I mentioned about, right? So if the different security incidents will have different processes, so you can feed that into the wiki page. All the threat cases across your environment, on the internet, your data center, your MPLS infrastructure, your server farms, etc. Workflow, which is your incident response program, right? And identifying and making sure that there's false positives or false negatives, and then you actually learn from the incident, and there's a feedback system in place. This will allow the organization to go from a reactive situation to being proactive, right? So the idea in compliance, or at least from a security maturity perspective, is always to go from the level 0, level 1 up to level 3 or 4. And this is basically epitomized in this diagram, right? So most of the organizations that don't have security in place, that are reactive, right, they typically tend to stay at CMM level, or capability maturity model level 1. But as you build a SOC, as you be more proactive, and as you start driving things in a better way, you move up the chain. Just finally, one of the things that you could do on a wiki, for example, is I'm sure you know about RSA. RSA token authentication, for example, is the two-factor authentication that you use to log in. What you could do is you could, for example, identify the different threat cases. You can see here you've got AAA RSA 001 to 007. These are the different threat cases. If there is an incident, for example, related to 001 where you have excessive reject messages, you can identify that, and it basically, you create an offense case using 001, and then from a security operations center perspective, whoever's got that offense ID would just put it into the wiki page and would get all the details about exactly what needs to be done to remediate that particular problem. So the idea is building better governance and better monitoring, being proactive when you're building security operations center. So that's my last slide. There's a lot of information within 30 minutes, but I hope you've got the gist of it. I'd like to thank DefCamp for inviting us. It was a pleasure being here, and if there's any questions, then by all means.
I know on a lot of the problems that you have when you're talking about incident response procedures and policies, that's a living document. It's like, because the technology is going to change. What's the best way to combat that? Because, you know, the people that you're going to contact for incident response are going to be different. Do you do it role-based, or do it specifically to the person? And also, how often should a company or organization look at their procedures and their policies and revisit that to try to update them and keep them current?
Good question. So typically, when it comes to building processes, usually if you look at the standards, they always mention to carry out, for example, a review of policies upon a major change within an infrastructure, or at least on a yearly basis. So that's at least what should happen on a yearly basis. But going back to your initial question of incident response, it really depends, right? It has to be service-based, so as opposed to, you know, system-based. So one of the things that we always tend to find is that when you're trying to do an incident response as a first responder, you go on site, you try to identify exactly what happened, but then you have the missing links. You can't actually put them together. And having a SOC in place will allow you to build these links, because as I gave an example, for example, for one of the oil and gas companies which was impacted, they left traces as they performed the attack, right? But having a SOC where you have all the logs being collected, you're able to do that. So it really depends.
Thank you.
No worries.
Any other questions? No? Then thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.